So last time we saw that Jacob had wanted to return to Canaan after roughly 14 years, or possibly more, serving his uncle Laban. But then Laban had offered him whatever wages he might choose. And Jacob had asked for all of the spotted and speckled sheep and goats and the black lambs from Laban's flock. And Laban agreed, but then tried to cheat Jacob out of even those wages when he took those speckled and spotted sheep and goats and the black lambs and gave them to his sons, who took them away. But then Jacob pulled this little, magic trick or whatever with these white sticks that he put in front of the flocks whenever they bred, and when they bred in front of the white sticks, then they bore spotted and speckled offspring and the black lambs. Now, we didn't mention it last time, but obviously this is where the term the black sheep comes from. You'd have to have a bunch of black sheep or black lambs in order to make black wool, right? And normally the wool was not black, so the black lambs were less valuable because they couldn't provide enough wool, basically. Now, Jacob thought that this little trick with the sticks was what caused him to prosper, and whenever he put the sticks in front of the livestock whenever they were breeding, then the speckled and spotted came out. But of course, we know that it was God's plan all along to bring forth Jesus, the Messiah, through through the seed or the offspring of Jacob's line. So God allowed Jacob to prosper in Padan Aram because that's what he wanted to do, not because of this silly trick that Jacob pulled. So we'll take up the story now. After Jacob had served Laban for another 6 years, and his flocks and herds had prospered during that time. In Genesis 31, verse 1, it says, "Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, 'Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all his wealth.' And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, 'Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you.'" Now remember from that previous study that Jacob had wanted to return to Canaan 6 years before this, but God had prevented it. And of course it was God's plan all along. So we know with hindsight that God needed his Messiah to be born in Bethlehem, and that he was to be of the house of Jacob's descendant, Judah, and from Judah, King David. The circumstances of the birth of the Messiah were later foretold to God's prophets, but in Jacob's day, they didn't have any of these prophecies yet. Nevertheless, God had promised to return Jacob to Canaan one day when he had that dream of the ladder that was ascending into heaven at Bethel. Remember in Genesis 28:15, God had promised to bring him back to the land. And now, at last, after 20 years, God was going to fulfill that promise here in Genesis 31:3. And God then commanded Jacob to return to Canaan. And, in this respect, this is a valuable lesson for us following God is more than just obeying what he says. It's trusting in that his will is always sovereign and that our best interests are always at his heart. God allowed Jacob to remain in service to his uncle to teach Jacob this same lesson, all the while blessing him. And you remember in Romans 8, Paul sort of confirmed this in verse 28. He says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers." Now, we know this, we read it, but like Jacob, sometimes the process of going through this perfection into the image of God's Son isn't always pleasant, and it can be very confusing. All the more for Jacob, since this perfecting of God's saints into the image of Jesus was still yet to begin hundreds of years in the future for Jacob when Jesus was born. And, it would have been, virtually impossible for him to see that all these things that he was going through were part of his plan to fulfill the promise that he'd spoken to him and to his father Isaac and to his grandfather Abraham, that through them, through their offspring, all the families of the world would be blessed. Nevertheless, we can rest assured that Jacob did see the fulfillment of these prophecies. Well, he saw the prophecies themselves being uttered, and then he saw their fulfillment with the birth of Jesus. And like us, he's anticipating the fulfillment of the salvation, the plan of salvation when Jesus returns and makes all things new. Jesus himself made this clear, that Jacob was aware of these things, or clued into them eventually, I guess. When in his response to the Pharisees, remember, or not the Pharisees, the Sadducees, remember they came to him and they had this strange hypothetical about a woman that had married a bunch of guys who had all died, and then she died, and then the question was, which one of them would be her husband in heaven. And of course they didn't believe that there was a heaven. They didn't believe in any resurrection. But Jesus' response is very, it's wonderful. In Mark 12, and this is in several of the Gospels, but in Mark particularly here, in Mark 12, verse 26, "And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, 'I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob'? He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong." How poignant and really tragic it is that they didn't even understand this after Jesus himself demonstrated resurrection, in that they were witnesses to it. Most of the Sadducees then, most of the people living today throughout the earth, still don't believe in Jesus' resurrection. But continuing in verse 4 of Genesis 31, "So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was, and said to them, 'I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Now, once again, I have to admit that I have a strong prejudice against the words of Jacob, despite my assurance that God had called him uh, as a critical component of his um, plan of salvation for all mankind to bring forth the Messiah through Jacob's line. Um, but Jacob proved time and again that he was a schemer and a conniver. So to me, he's a little bit like the boy who cried wolf in the famous Aesop's fable. Uh, he'd spoken deceptively so many times before, particularly to his own father when he was trying to deceive him into receiving the blessing that rightfully belonged to his elder twin brother Esau. When Isaac asked him, who are you, my son? Uh, uh, Jacob responded, I'm your son Esau. He lied straight up. Um, and Jacob lied so much and was such a schemer that even when he told the truth, his words are suspect, at least to me. So we don't really know if Laban had, changed Jacob's wages 10 times, like he said to his wives here. Of course, Laban himself was a schemer and a conniver. So he may very well have done that. Maybe it's true. Or maybe Jacob was exaggerating just to convince his wives, that they needed to come with him and leave their home. As it turned out, they didn't need much convincing. One thing, though, does ring true in this statement that Jacob made here. He says, let's see, but the God of my father has been with me. You remember he did that trick with the white sticks. That wasn't what caused him to prosper. And apparently Jacob is finally coming around to recognizing that it wasn't his own cleverness, it was God's sovereign will that caused him to prosper during his last few years serving Laban. Now, if we continue on now in verse 11, it says, Then the angel of God, and this is Jacob still talking to Leah and Rachel, right? It says, Then the angel of God, and that phrase, the angel of God, is Malach Elohim, we'll get to that in a minute, said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes and see, all the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and made a vow to me. Remember, Bethel is where he had that dream of the ladder ascending into heaven. Now arise, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred. Now, this phrase, Malach Elohim, that's translated as the angel of God, is worthy of a study, a detailed study, all on its own. We may do that sometime, but we're not going to do it right now. The word Malach means messenger or representative, and of course Elohim refers to the triune God, starting in Genesis 1:1 when it said, in the beginning God, that's Elohim. In Hebrew, there are three forms of nouns. There's the singular that we're familiar with. In this case, that would be El, God. And then there's a dual form, which there is no dual form of El. And then there's the three or more form, the true plural. And in that case, it's Elohim for the triune God. Now, this phrase, Malach Elohim, or the angel of God, only appears one time before this in God's Word. It was when the angel of God spoke to Ishmael's mother, Hagar, after Abraham had cast them out into the desert in Genesis 21:17. Sometimes we read of Malach Elohim, the angel of God, speaking to someone from heaven or in a dream. And in other places, we find Malak Elohim taking on some physical appearance. For example, in Exodus 14, verse 19, Malak Elohim led the Israelites in the form of a pillar of cloud. In Exodus 14:19, they had come up against the sea, the Red Sea, with Pharaoh's army pursuing them, and it says that the pillar of cloud, Malak Elohim, went from going before them to behind them, to stand between them and the Egyptian army and confuse the Egyptian army while they went across the sea. Now, this phrase Malak Elohim is very closely related to another phrase, Malak Yehovah or Malak Yahweh. That's normally translated in our modern English translations as the angel of the Lord, with Lord in all capital letters. Malak Yehovah appeared to Hagar in Genesis 16 when he was foretelling to her the birth of Ishmael. And we find both phrases in the story of Gideon's calling in Judges 6. In that case, Malak Elohim took the form of a man that was carrying a staff. In Genesis, here in Genesis 31, verses 11 through 13, Malak Elohim spoke to Jacob in a dream, just as he had done from the top of the stairway that he saw in Genesis 28, verses 10 through 22 at Bethel. But apparently this time, Malak Elohim didn't take any physical appearance. He just spoke to Jacob. So continuing in verse 14, it says, Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. In ancient Hebrew traditions, or in many cultures in the ancient world, and some even today, marriages were arranged by the parents of the bride and the groom, and specifically by the fathers, with the mother, having tacit approval, but not really having a voice in the arrangement. In those arrangements, those marriage arrangements, usually a dowry, also called a bride price, was paid by the groom's father to the bride's father. We saw that in the case of Isaac's marriage to Rebekah that we studied in Genesis 24. Abraham had sent his servant to get a wife for his son Isaac, and that servant gave very lavish gifts to Rebekah's family when he arrived in Padan Aram seeking a bride. We read there that those were called gifts, but they were in actuality a bride price for Rebekah. Now, the intention of the bride price, at least in ancient Hebrew tradition, was that it would be held in trust by the father of the bride in case the bride had to return home for some reason, if her husband died or some other reason. That money, that bride price, would then be used to support her after she'd returned to her father's family or her father's house. However, true to form, as always, Laban had apparently already spent the bride price that was given for Leah and Rachel on other things. Now, to be fair to Laban, we should remember that although we know that the bride price paid for Rebekah was quite lavish, we don't know what bride price, if any, Jacob paid for Leah and Rachel, apart from the 14 years of labor that we read about. Remember, Isaac, Jacob's father, wasn't really involved in this process at all. Uh, I don't know what Rebekah had told Isaac about Jacob disappearing. Remember, they deceived Isaac into giving Jacob his blessing, his dying blessing, apparently, or what they thought was his dying blessing anyway, because he was old and blind. But as it turns out, Isaac was still alive after this 20 years that Jacob spent in Padan Aram, but we're getting ahead of ourselves there. Now, we'll take up the question a little bit later whether Leah and Rachel were really followers of the one true and living God, but they did get one thing right here at the end of this passage in Genesis 31, verse 16, the last half of the verse. They say, "Now then, whatever God has said to you, do." That's good advice for all Christ followers. Whatever God has said to you, do. So continuing in verse 17, so Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels. He drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. And Jacob tricked Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he intended to flee. He fled with all that he had and arose and crossed the Euphrates. And that word Euphrates there is Nahar. We'll look at that in a minute. So he arose. He fled with all that he had, and arose and crossed the Euphrates and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. So take a look at this map, Jacob's return to Canaan. That shows a potential route that Jacob might have taken. This journey from Haran to Bethel was several hundred miles, and it would have taken many weeks on foot because they had to move slowly because they were driving all these flocks before them. The route on the map is just a guess. You might well question why Jacob turned so far to the west before crossing the Euphrates. Now, on these journeys that were, of course, done on foot and on beasts of burden, it was essential that they maintain, a steady source of water for themselves and for the animals. The direct route across the desert would not have provided those sources of water, and so everyone went sort of out of their way as they were going from Mesopotamia to Canaan, instead of going directly, because the desert is so harsh and so lacking in water. Now notice on the map that after leaving Damascus, I'm only guessing that Jacob continued down what was called the King's Highway, or the King's Road, that led up from Egypt to Damascus. Damascus is one of the oldest cities, continually occupied cities in the world. So in my, what would you say, presumed route that Jacob took, I have him staying to the east of the hills, the hill country of Bashan, which is east of the Sea of Galilee, known today as the Golan Heights, and staying east of the mountains that ran on the east side of the River Jordan. Now, the route from Damascus directly to the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and then around the southern end of the Sea of Galilee and up into the hill country of Samaria, would have been the easiest and most direct route for Jacob to take to get to Bethel. And it would have been much easier on the people and the animals, because the ascents and descents aren't as steep. But the word says in Genesis 31:21, says specifically that he set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. Gilead is the area east of the Jordan, between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. So he would have gone that way, apparently, for his own good reasons. Now, this word Nahar, it's translated here as the Euphrates in Genesis 31:21, but it's a general word that can mean any river. Of course, the Euphrates was the only, major river between Haran and Canaan. But, throughout the Old Testament, unless specifically stated otherwise, this word Nahar means the Euphrates. For example, you'll see the phrase the river of Egypt, Nahar Misraim. Anyway, if it doesn't say otherwise, you can assume that Nahar refers to the Euphrates. And there is at least one place where it speaks about the river Euphrates by its own name. So before we go on, let's take up this topic of Rachel stealing her father's household gods in Genesis 31:19. Now, these were small carved or cast idols that were used in private devotions in the home. The fact that these idols were present in Laban's home implies that Laban and his family were not exclusively followers of the living God, the real God. They had a mixture of gods. Of course, this is a direct disobedience of God's first commandment, but we need to cut these folks a little slack, because that commandment wouldn't be given to Moses for hundreds of years after this. But anyway, we can infer that they weren't, if they were followers of the living God, they weren't exclusive followers of the living God. They sort of had a mixture of so-called gods with a little g, right? Now, notice that it was Rachel that stole these idols, not Leah. Remember when we studied Jacob's marriages, I said, if Jacob had taken a little time to consider these girls' character instead of just going with the physical attraction, he might have, chosen Leah over Rachel initially. But of course, none of that was God's will. God wanted all 12 of the sons that were born to Jacob for his specific purposes. So it was necessary that Jacob marry Rachel and Leah and have children by their two maidservants, Zilpah and Bilhah. We don't know much about Leah's character, and we certainly know that the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree, but from this we know, at the very least, that Rachel was a thief. We'll find out later that she was a liar as well. So continuing in verse 22, when it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him and pursued him for 7 days, and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night, and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." And Laban overtook Jacob. Now, Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban and with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. As I said, if you take another look at that map, we don't know where Laban was when he found out, 3 days after Jacob's departure that Jacob and his family had gone. It's fair to assume that Jacob would have left in the opposite direction from where Laban was going, and maybe he had, waited until Laban was going somewhere not toward the river before making his break. Anyway, it's as fair to assume that he'd gone in the opposite direction. And then it took 3 days for somebody to come to Laban from Haran and give Laban the bad news. And then it took another 7 days for Laban to catch up with Jacob. Of course, as we said, the family had to travel much slower than Laban because they had all the Jacob's livestock to drive with them before them. Anyway, even though they were going much slower than Laban could have in pursuit, they had reached the hill country of Gilead before Laban caught up with them. Now, as I've already mentioned, I don't know whether Laban was a follower of the true God. We do know that he had these household idols. So if he did follow God, he didn't follow him exclusively. But despite that, God saw fit to come to Laban in a dream and warn him not to either bless or curse Jacob until he finally caught up with him. Then in verse 26 it says, "And Laban said to Jacob, 'What have you done that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why do you flee secretly and trick me, and did not tell me? Why did you flee secretly and trick me and did not tell me? So that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourines and lyre.'" Yeah, right. "And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm, but the God of your father," notice he says not our father, "spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.' And now you have gone away because you long greatly for your father's house, but why did you steal my gods?" Now, of course, we know Jacob did not steal his wives or force his wives to come with him when he left Padan Aram. We just read that they said, "Whatever God told you, do it." All right? Whether or not Laban believed that Jacob had taken the family by force, he was certainly being, less than truthful when he said he might have sent them away with a celebration with, mirth and songs and tambourine and lyre. Well, speaking of liars, of course he wouldn't have. He would have tried to convince Jacob to stay on. Now, for certain, Jacob had prospered in Laban's service, despite Laban's effort to cheat him out of his earnings. But for his part, Laban also benefited from Jacob's service. Neither of them had been exactly, truthful and honest and upfront in their dealings with one another. And in 20 whole years, that didn't change at all. So he says, "The God of your father," here. Take a look at the patriarchs of Israel diagram. Notice he didn't say our father. Presumably, when he said the God of your father, Laban meant Jacob's direct father, Isaac, but also Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, who was also the brother of Laban's grandfather. Certainly, all of Nahor's family, that's Laban's grandfather, Abraham's brother, the whole family would have been familiar with Abraham's being called out of Haran to Canaan. Remember, their father, Terah, had left Ur of the Chaldeans, which is down in southern Iraq, near where the Tigris and the Euphrates flow together, became Babylon eventually. He left there to go to Canaan, but stopped on the way in Mesopotamia in Haran. We read about that in Genesis 11, verse 31. And then from there, God called Abram, as Abraham was known then back then, on to Canaan about 25 years later. And then when Abraham's servant returned to Haran looking for a wife for Jacob's father, Isaac, both Laban and his father, Nahor, acknowledged God's hand in that. In Genesis 24, verse 50, after Abraham's servant had told them that he wanted to take Rebekah as Isaac's bride, it says, then Laban and Bethuel, that's Nahor's son, Laban's father, answered and said, the thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you, bad or good. Sound familiar? Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. Now, we don't know anyone's heart, anyone else's heart. And if the truth be told, oftentimes we don't know our own hearts. But taken together, I think all of these passages seem to indicate that Laban and presumably his daughters knew about God and acknowledged his power, but they weren't really wholehearted or exclusive believers and followers, since they still had household idols, as we've seen. Most people in most societies in the ancient world had a large collection of gods. They weren't monotheistic. This set the Hebrews apart, by the way, being monotheistic. Anyway, continuing in verse 31, it says, Jacob answered and said to Laban, and remember, Laban had just asked him, well, why did you leave, secretly? Jacob said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours, and take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them, that is, the household idols. Now, Jacob may have had a legitimate fear that Laban would take away his wives and children. He certainly had the means. He had probably multiple of his servants with him, and he probably could have outgunned and outmanned Jacob if it came to a fight. And, certainly Laban's past dealings with Jacob with regard to his wages and his daughters, or Jacob's wives, Laban had a bad track record. Jacob may have felt that his only option to obey God's command for him to leave Padan Aram and go back to the land of Canaan would have been to do it secretly without telling Laban. Now, with regard to this statement, this rash statement that he made, obviously Jacob didn't have full knowledge of the facts. He had no idea that Rachel had stolen those household idols. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made this rash statement that whoever was found with them would be put to death. I often wonder why God didn't just put a 7-second delay on our mouths like they have on radio, live radio, and television broadcasts to keep you from saying those 7 words you can't say on television. If Jacob had taken some time to consider this before he spoke, he probably would have reasoned that Laban didn't just make this up, right? Why would he bring something like that up out of the blue? If you'd have thought about it, you realize that somebody, probably one of his wives, had stolen his household, or Laban's household idols. And if he'd thought about it, he would have stopped before blurting out that whoever Laban found with him needed to die. My father used to call this ignorant speaking with the voice of authority. And in this respect, Jacob is a lesson for us that it would be wise for us to always think before we speak or act. So continuing in verse 33, so Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the 2 female servants, but he did not find them, that is, the household idols. And he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. Laban felt all around the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is with me." That, of course, is her menstrual period. So he searched, but did not find the household gods. Now, in this, we see, as we sort of alluded to earlier, that Rachel wasn't just a thief, she was also a liar. And, who can really blame her in this case, since Jacob had threatened to kill anybody that was found with Laban's household idols. So in verse 36, it says, "Then Jacob became angry and berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, 'What is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? For you have felt all through my goods, and what have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was, by day the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you for 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked you last night." So Jacob, having unwittingly gotten away with the theft of these household idols by his wife, his natural inclination, was to double down, right? And he took the opportunity not only to lambaste Laban about what he thought was this false accusation, but was actually a legitimate complaint by Laban. He continued, that is, Jacob continued, in a self-pitying, tirade. Poor Jacob, he suffered in the heat of the day and the cold of the night, not like any of the rest of them did, right? Isn't it heartbreaking to read about how he'd suffered so? Yeah, I guess I'm a little too hard on Jacob anyway. Now, notice we don't see Laban objecting to Jacob's claim that he'd changed his wages 10 times. Maybe it was true. Maybe, after all, he wasn't exaggerating. One thing Jacob did get right in this little diatribe that he went off on Laban with, apparently he finally recognized God's hand in his prosperity in Padan Aram. Not that little magic trick that he pulled with the white sticks, putting them in front of the flocks and herds when they bred. Then in verse 33, then Laban answered and said to Jacob, "The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day for these my daughters, or for their children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me." So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, "Gather stones." And they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Yegar Sahadutha, which means witness heap, but Jacob called it Galaid, which means witness heap. In their 2 languages. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." Therefore he named it Galain and Mitzpah, which means watchtower. For he said, "The Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives beside my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is witness between you and me." So, not to be outdone by his nephew with his little pity party, Laban matched Jacob's childishness with his own. Of course, Jacob's wives and children and livestock were Jacob's, not Laban's. He'd served Laban for 20 years for them. Laban clearly knew this, but he made himself out to be the victim of Jacob's deception and theft, saying that he had no option. He said, well, what can I do for these my daughters? He had no option to resign himself and let Jacob have them. Who knows? Maybe Laban actually believed all this, garbage that was spewing out of his mouth. In any case, he then turned the subject to this non-aggression pact between them. Look again at the map, the Jacob's Return to Canaan map. We have no way of knowing where this happened, where Galaad was, or Yegar Sahadutha and Mitzpah, as Laban also called it. We don't know where it was located. All we know is that it was somewhere in the hill country of Gilead. The specific location isn't important. What's really interesting about this is that it was Laban, not Jacob, who first called upon the Lord, that is Jehovah, and then called in the next verse in Genesis 31:50 as called upon God, Elohim, the triune God, as a witness of this agreement. Now, we shouldn't read too much into this, because although God was known at the time by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, that is God Almighty, it wasn't until later that God identified himself to Moses as Jehovah, or Yod He Vav He, Yahweh, but we really don't know how that name is pronounced. That was in Exodus 6:3. God said to Moses, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, that is El Shaddai. But by my name, the Lord, that is Jehovah or Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. So the fact that Jehovah and Elohim are here in Genesis 31, 49, and 50 isn't so much an indication that Laban, actually said that with those specific words, as it is an indication that God used Moses to write down the Genesis narrative hundreds of years later, after this encounter at the burning bush, where he said, I was known by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but they didn't know me by my real name, Jehovah or Yahweh. Anyway, continuing in verse 51, then Laban said to Jacob, see this heap and the pillar which I have set between you and me? This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and this pillar to me, to do harm. Doesn't mean they couldn't come and go. They just weren't to take up arms against one another. Then in verse 53, the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judged between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country and called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread and spent the night in the hill country. Early in the morning Laban arose and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home. Frankly, I find these last few verses in Genesis 31 a little disconcerting. Notice that once again, Laban refers to the God of Abraham and mentioned that he's also the God of Nahor, who is Abraham's brother and Laban's grandfather, implying that he is also the God of their father, Terah. Yet none of them, apart from Abraham, ever exhibited evidence of exclusive devotion to the one true and living God. In fact, we know for certain that Laban had these household idols that he used in his devotions at home. So we don't know whether Laban worshipped the real God either exclusively or alongside, we don't know whether he worshipped these idols exclusively or he worshipped them alongside the real God. But when the time came to formalize this covenant, it was Laban, not Jacob, who called on the name of God as a witness. Instead, Jacob swore by his own human father, Isaac. And that, is somewhat, as I said, disconcerting to me. Jacob was, we see it over and over and over again in the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We have to assume that these offerings were made to the real God, not to Isaac. But it still, kind of disturbs me. We'll just leave it at that. So next time we'll read about Jacob's reconciliation with his twin brother Esau as he was coming back into the land of Canaan, as Jacob was coming back into the land of Canaan. Remember, it was Esau that Jacob had run away from 20 years before, after he'd tricked their father Isaac into giving Jacob his blessing instead of Esau his blessing. Esau had said, when my father finally dies, I'm going to kill Jacob. And that was what caused Jacob to run away to Padan Aram for 20 years. So next time we'll look at the reconciliation of these two brothers, God willing.